Now the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Geraghty.
And welcome, everyone, to the Wednesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Along with Jim Geraghty of National Review, I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Good, bad, and crazy martinis for conservatives today, as usual. And Jim, yesterday in the House of Representatives, by a fairly comfortable margin, the lower chamber approved a full repeal of Obamacare. The liberal media will say this is the, 50th time that this has happened. It's actually the 5th. There's been votes to repeal specific parts of the bill several other times. But this one is for the full repeal. The Senate will likely take it up sometime later on and will probably pass it, or at least get a majority of a vote in the Senate. The downside here is that there were 3 Republican defections to oppose such a move and no Democrats supporting the move. But in the end, we know that with Obama as president, it's not going to be repealed anytime over the next 2 years. But Jim, despite what the media tried to portray as one of the reasons for the big Republican win last year, Obamacare was still a big part of it. The voters made that message loud and clear, and the Republicans are saying, hey, we heard you, and we haven't ignored you. We're going to be working on this.
If voting to repeal Obamacare is this terrible decision in the eyes of the public, why did Republicans win those giant majorities?
That's right.
Right? I mean, you can argue whether it doesn't, because Obama's going to veto it and it's going nowhere. Is it a waste of time? Yeah, okay. I mean, Obama just introduced a budget that's never going to become law. Washington does a lot of things that don't become law that they do. Does everything in the State of the Union become law? There are a lot of things that aren't going to become final passage. In this case, the point is to say, hey, this is what we want to do. Obama's going to veto this. We know it's not going to live, but this is our objective. We have said we're going to do it, and we're going to do it. And I don't see any harm coming from it. And I think there's a certain amount of reliability. I think there certainly are plenty of people in the Republican Party, and probably more than a few independents, who can't stand Obamacare and who will say, you know what? I will smile and say, attaboy, give him a pat on the back and say, all right, keep going at it. One way or another, we're going to get rid of this. And, that's what the Congressional Republicans ought to be doing.
They've made good on that commitment, at least in this very first step. And one thing I think conservatives might be a little bit disappointed in is that just a few days ago, there was the establishment of this working group to come up with the replacement for it. There have been other bills out there, and the creation of this working group now seems a little bit late to start that process. But again, it's another step in the process towards ripping this thing out by the roots, hopefully. And that's what a lot of conservatives want to see. All right, on to the bad martini now. And Jim, I don't think anybody's going to be surprised that this is our choice today, but it's with a little bit of different twist. We found out late yesterday morning, I think it was, that not only was the Jordanian pilot who was shot down by ISIS in December dead, but he was not killed by beheading. He was killed by being doused with fuel while standing in a cage and burned alive. Just horrific and beyond the pale. And the bad part, in addition to the fact that they just get more and more brutal, is how we are responding to it compared to others around the world. You saw it with the president's response to the terrorist attack against Charlie Hebdo in Paris. You see it again as he was being surrounded by people at an Obamacare event and him being reluctantly forced to comment on the fact that this pilot was burned to death. Here's his flat response, and we'll talk a little bit more about it on the other side.
Should, in fact, this video be authentic, it's just one more indication of the viciousness and barbarity of this organization. And it, I think, will redouble the vigilance and determination on the part of a global coalition to make sure that they are degraded and ultimately defeated. And it also just indicates the degree to which whatever ideology they're operating off of, it's bankrupt. We're here to talk about how to make people healthier and make their lives better.
Can I please talk about Obamacare now? And then later in the day, Jordan made it very clear what their response to this was. We're going to start killing convicted terrorists in our country, and they started with 2 this morning.
Greg, remember, they have that really historic and significant march in Paris. The president doesn't go. The president doesn't go to the event in Washington. The only thing the president was doing that day was watching football on TV. Remember how everyone kind of felt embarrassed? That this was something really important going on, And because it wasn't about him and it doesn't align with his agenda and ideology, that he just didn't feel it was important enough. And we were embarrassed we were not there for our allies. The quote you just played there, it kind of reminded me of what Obama said after the head. There's no passion in his voice. This topic bores him like nothing else. And it's kind of maddening because apparently, first of all, I don't know whether this was like deliberately timed or whether it's just an appropriate irony but King Abdullah is in Washington and was in Washington right after word broke that ISIS had burned this guy alive. And so apparently he's meeting with some leaders of Congress. According to Congressman Duncan Hunter Jr., he was in the meeting with the king, and he said the king was furious. And he said he mentioned Unforgiven, and he mentioned Clint Eastwood, and he actually quoted a part of the movie. I'll clean it up for the purposes of our podcast, but basically any man I see out there, I'm going to kill him. Any son of a you-know-what takes a shot at me, I'm not only going to kill him, I'm going to kill his wife and all of his friends and burn his darn house down. And you could picture the king saying that, all right? Now, for all of our problems in the Middle East, and I'm sure King Abdullah has said and done things we wouldn't necessarily like. When it comes to counterterrorism, the Jordanians are probably about as good an ally as we have, certainly in the Arab world. They have just been, punched in the gut. They have just had a great assault to one of their citizens, a member of their armed forces. This was clearly done for maximum horror and humiliation. Don't embarrass us, Mr. President. All right? This is, our ally needs us right now. We got to stand with them, and we got to show that we care. We got to show that this matters to us. We got to show that we're as angry as anybody else. And for you to roll out standard, terrible act of terror speech 487, it's not surprising foreign leaders don't like President Obama because what matters to them doesn't seem to matter to him.
Jim, you and I are old enough to remember when the Soviets shot down the South Korean airliner, I think it was in 1983. You could feel the seething rage beneath President Reagan in his televised address that night. Like he wanted to reach through the screen and strangle the Soviet premier if he had the technology to do so. You just don't get that here.
No. I remember the statement that Obama had said about when they beheaded Americans. And then, of course, he went off and went golfing. But remember later on he was quoted as saying to some of his advisors, he wished ISIS had just pinned notes to their chests and released them. Yes. Or if he was advising ISIS, that's what he would have recommended. This president doesn't seem to realize, the mentality of the opposition, that, the whole point of ISIS is not just to send a message and release them and all that stuff. I guess he thinks that they're trying to provoke us, and so his way of response is to act as if this doesn't really matter to us. The problem is it does matter to us when Americans are getting beheaded and when they're committing something awful like burning a Jordanian alive and putting up for the world to see. Last night, while clicking through the news, I saw they were showing live footage from Amman, Jordan, where there was obviously a crowd furiously chanting. They were outraged over this. They were just seething. And Greg, how rare is it that we as Americans get to see a group of Arab men shouting angrily in unison, and it's good news for us?
It's not very often. You're
right. I wanted to be there in that crowd and say, yes, we're with you guys. For all the other disagreements we might have, that ISIS is a bunch of bloodthirsty killers, that they are barbarians, savages, animals. And, when the King of Jordan says, saddle up, all right, where starts quoting Clint Eastwood, and we're going to rain hell on these guys, we got to be there with them. And it's just a baffling lack of passion and a lethargy on the part of our president.
All right, on to the crazy Martini now, Jim. And if Republicans stepping into the media trap over mandatory vaccinations wasn't crazy enough, well, thank you, North Carolina freshman Republican Senator Thom Tillis, for upping the ante yet again. Tillis was telling a story about how he thinks it's perhaps a good way to roll back regulations in general by making them more voluntary and then just making it known to the public whether or not businesses are abiding by certain regulations. And so he says he was having this debate with a friend of his in a Starbucks when a real living example of this debate walked past them. Here's how it went.
And at that time, we were sitting back at a table that was near the restrooms, and one of the employees just came out. She said, for example, don't you believe that this regulation that requires this gentleman to wash his hands before he serves your food is important, should be on the books? As a matter of fact, I think it's one that I can illustrate the point. I said, I don't have any problem with Starbucks if they choose to opt out of this policy, as long as they post a sign that says, we don't require our employees to wash their hands after leaving the restroom, the market will take care of it.
Jim, I'd bang my head against the desk, but I don't really want the concussion. Not really sure that this is the way to make the deregulation argument.
You know, I think back, the issues that really built the Republican Party throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and really, even well into the 90s. Between this and the vaccines, we've really gone soft on bacteria, haven't we? I mean, I remember this was a tough on crime, tough on scum, and tough on germs party. All right, so here's the thing. And I kind of wonder if this is a quasi-deliberate approach on the part of the left. And my colleague Jonah Goldberg writes really eloquently on this. There are a lot, it comes about the unwritten laws, right? Wash your hands after, before eating, or wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. For a long time was an unwritten law, right? I mean, you just did it. It's a good idea. You don't want to eat germs. You don't want to, you don't know what's happened in those public restrooms, and so you want to wash, We don't necessarily need a federal law over it. We don't necessarily need a federal regulation over it. We don't necessarily want the police arresting somebody for not washing their hands. But the left is willing to create a regulation over it. And of course, in a lot of restaurants, you see the signs, all employees are required and stuff like that.
Sure.
Tillis is trying to make a pretty decent point about whether we need all these little aspects of our lives regulated. And it's a perfectly fair point, and in fact, I think a general point most conservatives would agree with. But the example he picks, it's going to be very quickly construed as Thom Tillis thinks you shouldn't have to wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. And besides the fact this means that no one's going to shake his hand anymore, what's with Republicans, this crazy anarchic world in which any people are, not flushing the toilets and not washing their hands and all that stuff. And we'll be known as the pro-germ party. And I say, I kind of wish you could be a little more careful and precise about this and find a better example. Now, if he wants to say, look, there doesn't need to be a federal hand washing act of 2015, he's got a perfectly good point, but I kind of have this feeling, it just feels like, particularly in light of what we've seen with the vaccine talk earlier this week, in which the New York Times is pretending that anti-vaccination is this passionate conservative cause, when in fact it's usually the crunchy, hippie Marin County liberals who are the most vehemently opposed to it, and the Jenny McCarthy types who are convinced it causes autism and things like that. It kind of feels like that Tillis inadvertently helped advance a narrative here. Thus, I think it qualifies as our crazy martini for the day.
Jim, remember the old Head and Shoulders commercial, you never get a second chance to make a first impression? This is what people are going to think of Thom Tillis now. This is his first big media splash since he got elected to the Senate. So good luck shaking that off.
Splash and shaking that off. Wash your hands after listening to this edition of the Three Martini Lunch, everybody.
Gosh. Jim Geraghty of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. See you tomorrow, everyone, on the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch.